First of all, yesterday, the New Zealand Parliament, Jacinda Ardern was talking at the United Nations in New York.
If I could distill it down into one concept that we are pursuing in New Zealand, it is simple, and it is this: kindness. In the face of isolationism, protectionism, racism, the simple concept of looking outwardly and beyond ourselves, of kindness and collectivism, might just be as good a starting point as any.
But while she was in New York, going through the New Zealand Parliament was her bill, which is to introduce the bill to bring zero carbon emissions to New Zealand. And the beautiful thing about this bill is that it isn't just the government involved. They've been talking to business, they've been talking to the agricultural sector. They've got a significant methane problem in New Zealand because they have so many sheep and so much cattle from the milk industry. Whereas we have problems with our coal emissions, their big emissions problem comes from animals, and they're looking at ways of either reducing that or putting in trees that will negate it. But either way, they're bringing in a policy aiming to get zero emissions.
Yep.
Against that, yesterday the figures came out for Australian carbon emissions for the length of this particular government. So in 2014, the emissions that were being created in Australia was 525 million tonnes annually.
Yep.
They're aiming to get down, or what they signed for in the Paris Accord was to get down to between 430 and 440. So just remember those figures. 525 was the number, and they're aiming to get it down to 430. That's what we signed for.
Yep.
In truth, it's gone up to 555.
Yeah.
It's gone from 525 to 555 in 3 years, at a time when it should be going down.
Yeah. So what do you think about politicians that say we're on track for Paris?
That's rubbish.
How can they get away with that?
Total rubbish.
Yeah.
And we've got 12 years in order to get down to 430, 440. There is no way we're going to do it unless we bring in a charge on carbon, or we bring in really strict measures. Because when you think about the fact that we've gone up by 30 million tonnes, that's at a time when we've closed our dirtiest coal generator. We've closed Alcoa, which used vast amounts of electricity. We've closed their Anglesey power generating as well.
And we want to open the biggest carbon bomb in the world.
Yeah. Oh, look, and there are also world figures that have come out as well. The world figures between now and 2017, over the last year, we created 38.2 billion tonnes of carbon emissions per second over the course of the last year. In 2014, the figure was 9.795 gigatons. All these sound like telephone numbers, but if you bring them down into the way things are going, that's essentially flattened out. It has been rising right the way up until 2017, but now it's flattened. So we've managed to plateau the amount of emissions worldwide. And when you think about the way things have happened, we've shut down plenty of our industry here, but it's been opened up in China. And luckily, China is trying to cut down its emissions. So they've achieved, in world terms, a plateauing of the amount that we are creating as humans. Which has got to be a lot better than keep rising all the time.
And what you're saying, I think, is that we aren't contributing our bit. We're being leaners on that. Australia.
Australia.
Ours are trending up.
Australia and New Zealand on per capita, we're the highest in the world. Per capita, because we've got such a low population.
And New Zealand are doing something about it.
Oh yeah,
There's
they
just-
intend to cut theirs out completely,
Yeah.
and wind up neutral.
Yeah.
We're just careering along without giving a care.
Careering's a good word.
Yep.
When you look at tomorrow's Sunday Mail in Queensland, you see the type of activism that's being waged upon these particular industries. And if we go to the front page of the Sunday Mail, the headline is Green and Obscene Protest Campaign. Green activists will unleash war on freight rail operator Horizon with a cowardly campaign of illegal protests that threaten to disrupt Queensland's multi-billion-dollar coal exports. Protesters will be recruited from around Australia to sabotage the rail giant following the announcement of plans by Adani to connect into Horizon's network to haul coal from its proposed Carmichael mega mine in central Queensland. Now, that's the sort of rubbish that's happening in this state. That's the sort of rubbish that's happening around the country from these green activists. And in fact, we'll get to my column in a minute in tomorrow's Sunday papers, where I have an absolute red hot go at these greenies. They can't see the forest for the trees, these people, because they're besotted and obsessed with trying to stop these projects because they think they're saving the planet, when in fact what they're doing is they're stopping prosperity in the Australian way of life. Julian Tomlinson, I know you've got some very, very strong views on these people. What are your thoughts?
I believe the green groups are possibly the greatest threat to our lifestyles and our prosperity in the country at this moment in time. They deal in lies, they use intimidation, threats, they don't like fishing, they don't like hunting, they don't like mining, they don't like farming, they don't like logging. They put animal lives above human lives, they put trees above human lives. They are completely deluded. What's worse is that they get a great run in the media. Not many media outlets game enough to take them to task. As soon as they rock up to a Parliament House waving a placard, all the cameras come down and give them a great plug. I think that penalties for illegal protests should be drastically increased to provide more deterrent, so that they stop chaining themselves to trains, an Abbott Point bulk coal terminal, and let business get on with it. The bush is struggling. All those mining towns out there, Clermont, Blackwater, I was through there recently, they're a shadow of their former selves when the mining boom was on. We've got all the resources in the world. Let's get it out of the ground, let's sell it, and let's create jobs for our people, because people should come first.
Now, averaged over the last decade, emissions from fossil fuels and industry account for 91% of CO2 emissions in world terms. This came out at the same time as those other figures. 9% comes from land use. That's clearing of forests. So what we're actually putting in from industry is 91%. So the industry is the big one there. And of that, 9.9 billion tonnes of carbon goes in the form of CO2. 41% came from coal-fired burning of one kind or another, 34% from oil, 19% from gas, and 5.6% from cement production.
Yep.
That's my figures for you that I've got this week, and apart from that, it's just apologies and saying I won't be around next week.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colin Mockett. Now,
Just
Colin,
a few figures there to just think
chew
about.
to reflect on, and we do that all the time in this program, and we need to spend some time on translating what that means in reality. I wanted to ask you a question. Speaking of the global outlook, who's the captain on this ship? You know, spaceship Earth flying through space. Who's the captain?
Well, it should be. The United Nations is doing very well. They really do push. Angela Merkel in Europe is pushing it, and the Scandinavian company. We've spoken before about the number of countries that are now completely sustainably creating their power, all from sustainable. Unfortunately, they are all small nations. They're like Iceland and Puerto Rico and places. At the moment, the leaders, driving the thing are the Chinese government, the communist Chinese government. They're reducing the amount of emissions that they're putting out at a rate that is much, much better. America under Trump has flattened because California, luckily, has got a really good set of rules, and they are still reducing, while Trump is saying, don't worry about it, we want our steel industry back and things.
And the interesting thing is California in itself is the 5th largest economy in the world.
Yes.
So it means a lot when they take leadership on this space.
Yep.
Now, why I ask about who's the captain on the planet? I mean, I was just imagining if some aliens landed tomorrow, who would go and officially greet them on behalf of humanity? Who would be that person who did that? If you ask me, I think we have such a person. The top chief on this planet, as you said, he's the General Secretary of the United Nations.
And the United Nations were addressed yesterday by Donald Trump, and he got a really nice laugh when he said that my administration has achieved more than any other in America's history. They laughed at him, and he said, "Well, I didn't expect that response." Well, we should have all said, "Well, that's exactly the response to give him."
He's deluded, that man.
Yeah.
So I'm learning new words every week when I live here in Australia, with my Danish background. And one word I really took notice of, Tony, you mentioned it just before, the careening. What does it mean? To be walking?
Careering.
Careering.
Out of control.
It means running out of control, going downhill out of control.
Okay. Yeah. Because here's what our global chief, as I would call him, said a couple of weeks ago in a speech. He says, "We are careening towards the edge of the abyss."
Yep.
Dear friends, there is no more time to waste. As the ferocity of this summer's wildfires and heat waves shows, the world is changing before our eyes. We are careering towards the edge of the abyss. It is not too late to shift course, but every day that passes means the world eats up a little more and the cost of our inaction mounts. Every day we fail to act is a day that we step a little closer towards a fate that none of us want, a fate that will resonate through generations in the damage done to humankind and life on Earth.
Remarkable speech. It was put out on YouTube, and here's the funny thing. While, puppies and babies get millions of views within days on YouTube, when our, UN General Secretary gives a speech, here's the head of planet Earth giving a speech, and it's called a landmark climate change speech. How many views do you think it gets over the last 2 weeks? I checked yesterday. 4,000 views. That's where we're at. What's wrong here? Why aren't people listening? Why isn't this worth watching? Anyway, it's good we have the sustainable hour, isn't it? So we will not watch it because we can't send videos out, but we will certainly put it on our Facebook page, a link to that 20-minute long speech, and just play a little excerpt here as also a goodbye to you, so you have the UN chief in your ears as you walk out of the studio.
Ringing in my ears.
For green, clean, sustainable Geelong.
We need governments, industry and civil society reading from the same page, with governments front and centre driving the movement for climate action. And it is why I'm calling on civil society and young people in particular to campaign for climate action. Let us use the next year for transformational decisions in boardrooms, executive suites and parliaments across the world. Let us raise our sights, build coalitions and make our leaders listen. And I commit myself and the entire United Nations to this effort. We will support all leaders who will rise to the challenge I have outlined today. Dear friends, there is no more time to waste. As the ferocity of this summer's wildfires and heat waves shows, the world is changing before our eyes. We are careering towards the edge of the abyss. It is not too late to shift course, but every day that passes means the world eats up a little more and the cost of our inaction mounts. Every day we fail to act is a day that we step a little closer towards a fate that none of us want, a fate that will resonate through generations in the damage done to humankind and life on Earth. Our fate is in our hands. The world is counting on all of us to rise to the challenge before it is too late. I count on you all. Thank you.
Now, as politicians and governments, we all have choices in how we respond to these challenges. We can use the environment to blame nameless, faceless other, to feed the sense of insecurity, to retreat into greater levels of isolationism. Or we can acknowledge the problems we have and we can seek to fix them. In New Zealand, going it alone is not an option. Aside from our history as a trading nation, and proudly so, but even without those founding principles, there are not just questions of nationhood to consider, there are generational demands upon us too. It should hardly come as a surprise that we have seen a global trend of young people showing dissatisfaction with our political systems and calling on us to do things differently. Why wouldn't they? Where they themselves have had to adapt so rapidly to a changing world. Within a few short decades, we now have a generation who will grow up more connected than ever before. Digital transformation will determine whether the jobs they are training for will even exist in 2 decades. In education or the job market, they won't just compete with their neighbour, but their neighbouring country. This generation is a borderless one, at least in a virtual sense, one that increasingly sees themselves as global citizens. And as their reality changes, they expect that ours will too, that we'll see and understand our collective impact, and that we will change the way that we use our power. And if we're looking for an example of where the next generation is calling on us to make that change, we need look no further than climate change. 2 weeks ago, Pacific Island leaders gathered together at the Pacific Islands Forum. It was at this meeting on the small island nation of Nauru that climate change was declared to be the single biggest threat to security in the Pacific. Please just think about that for a moment. Of all of the challenges we debate and discuss, rising sea levels present the single biggest threat to our region. For those who live in the South Pacific, the impacts of climate change are not academic or even arguable. They are watching the sea levels rise, the extreme weather events increase, and the impact on their water supply and food crops. Now, we can talk all we like about the science and what it means, what temperature rises we need to limit in order to survive, but there is a grinding reality in hearing someone from a Pacific island talk about where the sea was when they were a child and the potential loss of their entire village as an adult. Our action in the wake of this global challenge remains optional, but the impact of inaction does not. Nations like Tuvalu, the Marshall Islands, or Kiribati, small countries who have contributed the least to global climate change, are and will suffer the full force of a warming planet. If my Pacific neighbours do not have the option of opting out of the effects of climate change, why should we be able to opt out of taking action to stop it? Any disintegration of multilateralism, any undermining of climate-related targets and agreements aren't interesting footnotes in geopolitical history. They are catastrophic. In New Zealand, we are determined to play our part. We will not issue any further offshore oil and gas exploration permits. We have set a goal of 100% renewable energy generation by 2035, established a green infrastructure fund to encourage innovation, and rolled out an initiative to plant 1 billion trees over the next 10 years. These plans are unashamedly ambitious. The threat climate change poses demands it. But we only represent less than 0.2% of global emissions. That's why, as a global community, not since the inception of the United Nations has there been a greater example of the importance of collective action and multilateralism than climate change. It should be a rallying cry to all of us.